For church leaders and schools considering classical Lutheran education, let me encourage you with this. You can do this, one step at a time. Prior to making the shift to classical education, I was personally a high school history teacher in public schools for 13 years. And with each passing year, I implemented more classical methodology and pedagogy in my classroom. And it was amazing to see the results and how they differed from what I was getting when I was using the progressive methodologies. Now, if I can take steps in a classical direction in that environment, you can take steps in your environment too. So I'd like to encourage you with what I see as some of the wonderful gifts and benefits of a classical education, and which also could be considered core principles to implement for moving in a classical direction. First off, a classical education has a twin telos, two goals, two primary ends, faithful life in this world and the next. Right? So it properly understands the human being as both a being that lives within communities on this earth, but is ultimately designed for communion with God. Right? So it properly situates both of those teloi, both of those ends, those goals. Secondly, a classical Christian education utilizes curriculum permeation and integration. The subjects are not isolated, distinct units that never cross over. These things are united together. And by doing so, we really recapture the old idea of the university, right? That math, science, literature, history, all of the various subjects are connected together. They all sort of orbit around Christ the Logos himself. Thirdly, a classical Christian education taps into the power of memory and story. Right? This is true with any subject. You need to memorize things, right? You need to know the facts. You need to know the terms. You need to know the grammar of each subject, if you will, right? But that you don't stop there, right? That then allows you to better engage with the story of that subject and the deeper questions of each subject. So you have to have the memory and the story together. Fourthly, a classical Lutheran education is a study of God's Word and His world, the Logos and the cosmos. Now, this is my sort of spin on the trivium and the quadrivium. And I know I'm simplifying things here vastly, but sometimes those terms, trivium and quadrivium, sort of scare people away when they're getting into classical education, or they can be intimidating. So all I'm trying to say is that the trivium and the quadrivium can broadly be understood as a study of logos and cosmos, word and world. Okay, in the study of the logos, we're learning how to write well, how to communicate well. We're learning grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And in the study of the cosmos, we're doing math and science, music, arithmetic, and so forth, astronomy. We're doing all of the things to learn God's world more successfully. Right? Again, much more could be said about quadrivium and trivium, but that's a good starting point, logos and cosmos. Another thing with classical education is that it really is a great conversation. We are ushering the students into the great conversation that's been taking place throughout all times and places. Education is really dealing with these big questions of the great conversation. Who am I? What is the world? How did it get here? Where am I going? Who is God? Right? These massive questions that all subjects bump up against in some way. The great thing about classical Christian education is you can go there to those questions. Those aren't off limits. Those are the questions you want to go to and are driven to within this system. And lastly, a classical Christian education culminates in the life of the church. All of this is driving towards our ultimate end as beings who are designed for communion with God, knowledge with God, unity, union with God. A classical Lutheran education moves us in that direction. Human civilizations are always built around some sort of act of worship. In your churches and schools, you have the privilege of doing so rightly. To take your students, as Stratford Caldecott says, quote, into the source of the cosmos itself, into the sacred precincts of the Holy Trinity, where all things begin and end, and to the source of all artistic and scientific inspiration of all culture.